Prince Alexander sat quietly in his favorite reading corner of the palace library, his small fingers tracing the golden letters on the cover of an old fairy tale book. At 8 years old, he was different from what people expected a prince to be. While other royal children his age might demand attention or throw tantrums when they didn't get their way, Alexander preferred the gentle whisper of turning pages and the soft afternoon light that streamed through the tall library windows. The young prince had soft brown hair that his mother, Queen Isabella, always tried to keep perfectly combed, though it had a habit of falling into his curious green eyes. He was small for his age, which made the palace guards smile whenever they saw him walking the grand hallways with his shoulders straight, trying his best to look as royal as possible. Captain Marcus, the head of the royal guard, often watched the little prince with interest. Unlike his older brother, Prince William, who loved sword-fighting lessons and commanded attention wherever he went, Alexander seemed to notice things others missed. He would stop to watch the palace gardeners tending to flowers, or pause to listen when the kitchen maids hummed while they worked. "That boy has something special," Captain Marcus often told his fellow guards. "Mark my words, there's more to him than meets the eye." The palace was a busy place, especially during the autumn months when important visitors came to discuss trade agreements and political matters with King Frederick. The royal guards worked extra hours, their heavy boots echoing through the marble corridors as they maintained security and protocol. Their uniforms were crisp and perfect, their faces serious and professional. They had trained for years to protect the royal family, and they took their duties very seriously. Alexander understood that the guards had important work to do. He had been taught palace etiquette from a young age, learning to walk quietly through certain areas and to always show respect to the staff. But unlike the formal lessons about royal behavior, Alexander's kindness came naturally. When he passed guards in the hallway, he would offer a small smile or a polite nod, never demanding they stop their duties to acknowledge him. One particular Tuesday morning, Alexander noticed something that made him pause during his walk to the dining room. Guard Thomas, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, was standing at his post near the main entrance, but his usual straight posture seemed different. His shoulders were slightly slumped, and when he thought no one was looking, he rubbed his temples as if his head hurt. Prince Alexander had seen Guard Thomas every day for as long as he could remember. The man had always stood perfectly still, watching over the palace entrance with dedication. Thomas had been there when Alexander was learning to walk, when he took his first steps down the grand staircase, and during countless royal events over the years. The young prince slowed his pace, pretending to examine a portrait on the wall while he observed Guard Thomas more carefully. The man's face looked pale, and Alexander noticed how he occasionally closed his eyes for just a moment longer than a normal blink. Something was clearly wrong. But Thomas continued to stand at his post without complaint. Throughout breakfast with his family, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. His father, King Frederick, discussed the day's scheduled meetings with visiting ministers. His mother talked about the upcoming royal charity event that would bring many guests to the palace. Prince William excitedly described his morning riding lesson. But Alexander's mind kept returning to the image of Guard Thomas looking unwell. After breakfast, Alexander asked his tutor, Mr. Pemberton, if they could have their history lesson in the library near the main entrance instead of their usual classroom. Mr. Pemberton, a kind elderly man who had taught royal children for many years, agreed to the change without question. He had learned that Prince Alexander often had good reasons for his quiet requests. As they settled into their lesson about the history of the kingdom, Alexander positioned himself where he could see Guard Thomas through the library's glass doors. His concern grew as he watched the faithful guard sway slightly on his feet. Thomas was clearly fighting against whatever was making him feel sick, determined to fulfill his duty despite his discomfort. During their break between history and mathematics, Alexander made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. Instead of staying in the library as expected, he walked quietly toward the main entrance. His heart beat a little faster as he approached Guard Thomas, who immediately straightened when he saw the young prince coming. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas said, his voice professional despite his obvious discomfort. "Good morning, Guard Thomas," Alexander replied softly. Then, instead of simply walking past as protocol would suggest, he stopped and looked up at the tall guard with concern in his young eyes. "Are you feeling all right?" the prince asked, his voice gentle and sincere. Thomas was surprised by the question. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked about his well-being while he was on duty. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Protocol demanded that he maintain his professional composure, but the genuine worry in the young prince's voice made it difficult to give a standard reply. "I am quite well, Your Highness, thank you for asking," Thomas answered, though his voice wavered slightly. Prince Alexander studied the guard's pale face and noticed the small beads of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool autumn air. The boy had inherited his mother's ability to read people's emotions, and he could see that Guard Thomas was not being entirely truthful about feeling well. Prince Alexander looked at Guard Thomas for a long moment, his young mind working to understand what he should do. He had been taught that royal family members should not interfere with palace staff duties, but he had also been taught that kindness was the most important quality a future king could possess. "Guard Thomas," Alexander said quietly, "I think you should sit down for a moment." The guard's eyes widened in surprise. "Your Highness, I cannot leave my post. The palace security protocols require—" "I know about the protocols," Alexander interrupted gently. "But I also know that you've been standing here for hours and you don't look well. When was the last time you had something to drink or eat?" Thomas was touched by the prince's concern, but he shook his head firmly. "I appreciate your kindness, Your Highness, but I have my orders. I must remain at my station until my replacement arrives in 3 hours." Prince Alexander frowned. 3 more hours seemed like a very long time for someone who was clearly struggling. He looked around the grand entrance hall, thinking carefully. Then, to Guard Thomas's complete amazement, the young prince walked over to one of the elegant chairs near the entrance and began pushing it toward the guard station. "Your Highness, please don't—" Thomas started to protest, but Alexander held up a small hand. "You can still watch the entrance from here," Alexander explained, as he positioned the chair behind Thomas. "You'll be doing your job, but you won't have to stand. Sometimes being smart is more important than following rules exactly." Other guards throughout the palace began to notice what was happening. Guard Robert, stationed near the staircase, watched in astonishment as the 8-year-old prince carefully arranged the chair so Thomas could sit while still maintaining a clear view of the entrance. Word began to spread quietly among the staff that something unusual was taking place in the main hall. Captain Marcus, who had been reviewing duty schedules in his office, received a message from one of his officers about the situation. He quickly made his way to the main entrance, expecting to find some sort of protocol violation that would require his intervention. Instead, he found Prince Alexander standing beside Guard Thomas, who was now gratefully seated in the chair the prince had provided. "Captain," Alexander said when he saw Marcus approaching, "Guard Thomas hasn't been feeling well, but he didn't want to leave his post. I thought this might be a good solution." Captain Marcus looked at the scene before him with amazement. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The young prince had identified a problem and solved it with both compassion and practical thinking. Thomas could indeed still perform his duties while seated, and his health would benefit from the rest. "That's very thoughtful of you, Your Highness," Captain Marcus said, his voice filled with respect. "Perhaps Guard Thomas would also benefit from some water and a light meal." Alexander's face brightened. "Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking. Should I ask the kitchen staff to prepare something?" Before Captain Marcus could respond, Prince Alexander was already walking toward the kitchen, his small feet moving quickly across the marble floor. The captain and guard Thomas exchanged a look of amazement. Neither of them had ever seen a royal family member personally attend to a guard's needs in such a direct way. In the kitchen, Alexander found Mrs. Patterson, the head cook, preparing ingredients for the day's meals. She looked surprised to see the young prince in her domain, as royal family members typically communicated with kitchen staff through formal requests. "Mrs. Patterson," Alexander said politely, "Guard Thomas isn't feeling well, and I was wondering if you could prepare some soup and tea for him, something that would help him feel better." Mrs. Patterson's motherly instincts immediately took over. "Of course, Your Highness. Is the poor man ill? Should we call the palace physician?" "I think he just needs some food and rest," Alexander replied. "He's been standing at his post for a long time without eating anything." Within minutes, Mrs. Patterson had prepared a bowl of warm chicken soup, some fresh bread, and a pot of strong tea. Alexander carefully carried the tea tray himself, despite Mrs. Patterson's protests that a servant should handle such tasks. The prince insisted that he wanted to deliver it personally. When Alexander returned to the main entrance with the food and tea, a small crowd had gathered. Several guards from different stations had found reasons to pass by the main hall, curious about the unusual situation. Palace staff members whispered quietly among themselves, amazed by what they were witnessing. Guard Thomas looked uncomfortable with all the attention, but Alexander seemed completely natural as he set the tea tray on a small table beside the chair. "Mrs. Patterson made chicken soup," Alexander told Thomas with a smile. "She said it would help you feel stronger, and the tea is very hot, so be careful." As Thomas gratefully accepted the meal, Prince Alexander did something that surprised everyone even more. Instead of leaving to return to his lessons, he sat down on the marble floor beside the guard's chair. He pulled out a small book from his pocket and began to read quietly, clearly intending to keep Thomas company while he ate. Captain Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. In 30 years of service, he had never seen such genuine kindness from someone so young. The other guards around the hall seemed equally moved by the prince's simple act of compassion. "Your Highness," Thomas said softly, "you don't need to sit with me. I'm sure you have important lessons waiting." Alexander looked up from his book with a gentle smile. "My lessons can wait a little while. Besides, I like reading here. The light is very good." For the next 20 minutes, Prince Alexander sat quietly beside Guard Thomas, occasionally looking up from his book to ask if the soup was helping or if Thomas needed anything else. The palace staff who witnessed this scene would talk about it for years to come, but not because it was strange or inappropriate. They would remember it because it showed them something beautiful about true leadership and kindness. When Thomas had finished eating and was looking much better, Alexander stood up and brushed off his clothes. "Do you feel stronger now?" he asked, with genuine concern. "Much better, Your Highness. Thank you for your kindness. I will never forget what you've done for me today." Prince Alexander smiled and gave a small bow, the same respectful gesture he had been taught to give to important visitors to the palace. "Thank you for taking such good care of our home, Guard Thomas. I hope you feel completely well very soon." As Alexander walked back toward the library to continue his lessons, every guard in the main hall stood a little straighter and watched him with new eyes. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, not a display of royal power or privilege, but an 8-year-old boy choosing kindness over protocol and treating a palace guard with the same respect he would show to a visiting king. By evening, the story of Prince Alexander's kindness had traveled throughout the entire palace. Servants whispered about it in the corridors, guards discussed it during their meal breaks, and even the visiting ministers had heard about the young prince who had personally cared for an unwell guard. King Frederick and Queen Isabella learned about their son's actions when Captain Marcus requested a private meeting with them. The captain, a man who rarely showed emotion, had to pause several times during his report as he described Alexander's natural compassion and thoughtfulness. "Your Majesties," Captain Marcus said, his voice filled with respect, "in all my years of service, I have never witnessed such genuine leadership from someone so young. Prince Alexander didn't just notice that Guard Thomas was unwell. He took action to help, even though it meant stepping outside normal protocol." Queen Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to the captain's account. She had always known her younger son was special, but hearing about his kindness from others made her heart swell with pride. King Frederick listened carefully, nodding as Captain Marcus described each detail of Alexander's actions. When the captain finished his report, the king was quiet for a long moment. "Captain Marcus," the king finally said, "what was the reaction of the other guards to my son's behavior?" "Your Majesty." Every guard who witnessed Prince Alexander's kindness was deeply moved. They spoke about it with great respect and admiration. Many said they had never seen such natural leadership qualities in someone so young. The next morning brought an unexpected development. When Prince Alexander walked to the dining room for breakfast, he found something different in the main hallway. Every guard he passed stood at attention and offered him a slight bow, not because protocol required it, but because they genuinely wanted to show their respect. Guard Robert, who had witnessed the previous day's events, stepped slightly aside as Alexander approached. Not because he was ordered to, but because he felt the young prince had earned a special kind of recognition through his actions. Alexander noticed the change but didn't understand why it was happening. He continued to greet each guard with the same gentle smile and polite nod he had always used, completely unaware that his simple act of kindness had transformed how the palace staff viewed him. During breakfast, Prince William mentioned something he had heard from his sword-fighting instructor. "Alex," William said, using his younger brother's nickname, "all the guards are talking about what you did yesterday. They're saying you're going to be a great king someday." Alexander looked confused. "I just helped guard Thomas because he wasn't feeling well. Anyone would have done the same thing." King Frederick smiled at his younger son's innocent response. "No, Alexander. Not everyone would have done what you did. You saw someone who needed help, and you helped them without thinking about whether it was convenient or proper. That's what real leadership looks like." Throughout the following days, Alexander noticed that his walks through the palace felt different. Guards, who had always been polite but distant, now seemed genuinely happy to see him. They would share small smiles when he passed, and some even began to tell him about their families or ask about his studies. Guard Thomas, who had fully recovered from his illness, became especially fond of the young prince. Whenever Alexander passed his station, Thomas would update him on how he was feeling and thank him again for his kindness. The guard had asked Mrs. Patterson to teach him about the prince's favorite foods so he could make sure Alexander always had access to healthy snacks during his long study sessions. Captain Marcus implemented a new policy that surprised everyone. He announced that guards who were feeling unwell should inform their supervisors immediately rather than trying to work through illness. He also arranged for chairs to be placed at certain guard stations where sitting would not interfere with security duties. "Prince Alexander showed us that taking care of our people makes them stronger, not weaker," Captain Marcus explained to his officers. "If an 8-year-old boy can understand that, certainly we can too." The changes in the palace extended beyond just the guards. Kitchen staff began to pay extra attention to Alexander's favorite meals. Not because they were ordered to, but because they genuinely cared about the kind young prince who had shown such thoughtfulness. Gardeners would save the most beautiful flowers to show him during his walks. Even the stern palace librarian, Mr. Henderson, began setting aside interesting new books he thought Alexander might enjoy. One afternoon, several weeks after the incident with guard Thomas, Prince Alexander was reading in the library when he overheard two visiting ministers talking in the hallway. "I've heard remarkable things about the younger prince," one minister said to the other. "They say he has a natural understanding of leadership that's quite impressive for someone his age." "Yes," the other minister replied. "My sources tell me the palace staff speak of him with genuine affection and respect. That's not common among royal households. Usually staff members serve out of duty alone." Alexander didn't fully understand what the ministers meant, but their words made him think about his father's lessons on leadership and responsibility. He had always been taught that being a prince meant serving others, not being served by them. Perhaps what he had done for guard Thomas was simply what he was supposed to do as a member of the royal family. That evening, as Alexander was getting ready for bed, Queen Isabella came to his room for their nightly talk. "Alexander," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed, "do you know that everyone in the palace is talking about what you did for guard Thomas?" Alexander nodded. "People have been acting differently toward me. I'm not sure why." Queen Isabella smiled and brushed his hair away from his eyes. "They're treating you differently because you showed them something important. You showed them that true strength comes from caring about others, especially when no one is watching or expecting you to care." "But, Mother," Alexander said thoughtfully, "I just did what felt right. Guard Thomas looked sick and I wanted to help him feel better." "Exactly," the Queen replied. "You followed your heart instead of just following rules. That's what makes a great leader, sweetheart. Anyone can learn rules and protocols, but not everyone has a heart that naturally wants to help others." As autumn turned into winter, the story of Prince Alexander's gentle kindness continued to spread beyond the palace walls. Visitors would often comment on the unusual warmth and loyalty they sensed among the palace staff. Some even requested to meet the young prince who had earned such genuine respect through his actions. Alexander remained the same gentle, thoughtful boy he had always been, but now he carried with him the knowledge that kindness could make a real difference in people's lives. He continued to notice when others needed help, and he continued to offer that help naturally and without expectation of recognition. The palace guards, who had once viewed their duties as simply protecting the royal family, began to see themselves as part of something larger, a household built on mutual respect and genuine care. They took pride in serving a family that included someone like Prince Alexander, who had shown them that true nobility came not from titles or power, but from treating every person with dignity and compassion. Years later, when Alexander would become king, people would remember this story as the moment when everyone knew he would be a different kind of ruler, one who led with his heart as much as his mind, and who understood that the greatest strength came from lifting others up rather than standing above them.